earlier this year, we let you know that if you are buying a home in Washington state, whether you knew it or not, starting January 1st, you're paying into a reparations program. And when we did that story, a lot of people were like, what are you talking about? I didn't hear anything about that. It goes back to a bill that was previously passed in the state legislature called the Covenant Homeownership Program. And what they do is you go into the recorder's office when you purchase a home. Let's say you've got to file 5 documents with the recorder's office. Well, each of them has an added $100 fee that you will have to pay. And that goes into this homeownership program that helps people of color buy a home for the first time. It's a reparations program. So when we covered this, we were just letting people know that they'd started to collect that money at the recorder's office. Well, now they are starting the program to actually allow people of color to use funds from the fund that people have been paying into. So the Seattle Times reported on that development, that now this is fully operational. People who qualify for the program can start getting down payment assistance, et cetera, et cetera. But something struck me about the Seattle Times story. So here's the headline. WA program to help first-time homebuyers with history of discrimination. It calls it, in the reporting, an explicit effort to redress the lasting efforts of discrimination. The Covenant Homeownership Program could help hundreds of people of color become homeowners in Washington, but it may also face legal challenges. The Seattle Times goes on to say, the new assistance is open to Washingtonians who can show either that they lived in the state before April of 1968, when the Fair Housing Act outlawed housing discrimination, or that they are descendant of a parent or grandparent who lived in the state at that time. State guidelines allow homebuyers to qualify if they are Black, Hispanic, Native American, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander, Korean, or Asian Indian. So this is a very lengthy article from the Seattle Times on the Covenant Homeownership Program. There is one word that does not appear in the article at all. What do you think it is? One word in this entire article that is about a reparations program that does not appear one time. It is the word reparations. Nowhere in the Seattle Times reporting on this do they refer to the program as reparations. And people might say, well, Brandi, that's because you're calling it reparations, but they call it a covenant home ownership program. So they're just calling it what it actually is labeled under the law. No, reparations, calling this reparations, remember, it does not come from me. I am not the first one to call this a reparations program. Representative Jamila Taylor, a Democrat who sponsored the bill, called it a reparations program.
You may not have heard, but this is the first in the nation statewide reparations bill.
Woo! First in the nation statewide reparations bill. That's what the Democrat who sponsored the bill called it the day Governor Jay Inslee signed it, a first in the nation of its kind reparations bill. Woo! Applause. But now in this entire Seattle Times article, nowhere in it do they call it reparations. Why do you think that is? That's a choice. That's a choice. And when we talk about media bias, oftentimes it's bias that is the result of omission. It's not necessarily what they choose to cover, but what they choose not to cover or how they choose to cover something. It is an absolute choice by the Seattle Times not to use the word reparations in their reporting. And that's because reparations are not popular. The idea of reparations is not popular even among a lot of progressives and Democrats. So the Seattle Times is making a choice not to call this a reparations program, despite the fact that the bill's Democratic sponsor celebrated the fact that it is a reparations program. Also, when you call it a reparations program, you are going to get more attention toward it. Some of that attention is not going to be positive, and some of that attention is likely going to result in lawsuits. We know there's a lawsuit already in Evanston, Illinois. They have a reparations program there. It's being sued over under the Equal Protections Clause. It's really only a matter of time before someone comes forth and sues over the Covenant Home Ownership Program, aka reparations. But think about that. No mention of the word reparations, because the Seattle Times is making a choice that reparations are not popular, reparations have a negative connotation among some people, so we're just going to choose not to use the word at all. And I think that that is deeply dishonest. Call it what it is. Call it what the bill's sponsor called it. Now, there's one other element to this story, totally separate, that I'm just learning about now, and I don't think it's shocking to me, but it just shows that Democrats only care about certain kinds of discrimination. So in the Seattle Times article, as I had mentioned earlier in the reporting, you could qualify for this if you're Black, Hispanic, Native American, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, Korean, or Asian Indian. The Seattle Times article does say this. The assistance focuses on people who may have been subject to racially restrictive covenants, one of the various tools of housing discrimination that were common across America in the early 1900s. The widely used documents and property deeds often barred people of color and Jewish people from certain properties. Then it goes on to say, while various groups, including Jewish people, experienced, quote, well-documented, egregious acts of discrimination, the qualifying groups for this program are the ones still being impacted most deeply or face notable home ownership gaps, wrote the authors of a state commission study whose findings informed the design of the program. So here you have an acknowledgement that there are multiple groups of people in our state and in our nation's history that were explicitly discriminated against when it came to fair housing. There were people of color, I don't think anyone denies that, and then there were Jewish people who, according to the authors of this study that informed this law, suffered well-documented egregious acts of discrimination. But the only ones that they're trying to make whole again through this program are people based on the pigmentation of their skin, not based on religion, which happens to be Jewish at a time when a lot of people on the left and progressives and on the far left are, in my opinion, engaged in severe acts of anti-Semitism. So look, I wouldn't be in favor of this if it did benefit Jewish people either, because I don't think it's constitutional. But here they are admittedly saying, in our history, there are documented egregious acts of housing discrimination against these groups of people, Black people, Asians. We're going to help them, make them whole again in their terms, but we're not going to help Jewish people specifically, despite the fact that they were also discriminated against. Fascinating, isn't it? Fascinating, isn't it? Now, I'll also say that one of the other things that makes that even worse is the covenant homeownership program does not require that you prove that you or a parent or a grandparent were actually discriminated against, or that you had a grandparent who even attempted to get housing in Washington state pre-1968. Basically, you just have to have a parent or grandparent who was a person of color who lived in the state of Washington pre-1968. There is no burden of proof. That's what I think makes it unconstitutional. Because if you were able to prove that, hey, we were discriminated against in 1996 or in 1966 from buying a house because of the color of our skin, then that's a legitimate claim. The government discriminated against you directly, and you can prove harm there. But so this is a program that just basically says, hey, if you had a parent or grandparent, they're a person of color, we're going to require other tax-paying citizens to help you afford your first home. Blatantly unconstitutional. Blatantly unconstitutional, especially now considering you are admittedly excluding Jewish people from that benefit, despite the fact that they were also segregated against. They were also discriminated against, rather, in housing. We don't care about them because, oh, well, they're white. You know, a lot of the Jewish people are white, so no bother there. I guess unless you're a Jewish person of color, then you can get help from the home ownership program based on your skin tone, but not your religion. So someone needs to sue over this. And I think it's someone who is a new home, who's buying, or not even a new home buyer, who's buying a home in Washington state. If you're purchasing a home in Washington state, whether it's your first home or your fifth home, and you have to pay the fee at the recorder's office to go into this program, you have grounds to sue over it. Hell, you don't even have to be white. You don't even have to be white. Everyone's paying into it when they buy a home. So you could be a black person in Washington state purchasing a home, you have to pay into a program that's going to help other Black people get their first home, even if they weren't directly discriminated against. You absolutely have a constitutional case. And I'm sure we could help you find an attorney who would take that one up. But it's really interesting that just sort of detail on how Jewish people admittedly acknowledged, they were discriminated against too, but we're not going to help them. We're just going to help people based on the color of their skin. Insane. Seattle Times, reparations. Call it what it is, and call it what the Democratic sponsor called it.